right. So I'm going to keep it on like the PowerPoint main screen here so I can bounce between other applications. Um, so I tried to get this just for record sets like altas and exhibits for survey, but as I started writing it, I have some to-dos for maps and grading plans and other stuff, and I was seeing like a lot of common things as I was just brainstorming. And some of this stuff I might recycle into other things. So I'm going to try to get through the first couple parts without rambling on too much. But I kind of saw a lot of common things I've done in my career on about every technical project, whether it's engineering or survey or a site map, or maybe a really specific document for like a report. There were some things I kind of saw common threads in all of them, but I'll try to get through some of those parts fast and get more in the drawings and QC part, which is a little more specific to us. So that's my caveat is that this isn't necessarily, you can apply it to a bunch of areas. But I think step 2 through 4 will be a little more specific to us. Like, what are the documents we're looking for? Where on DJNA, bookmarks, internet URLs, OneNote. I'll throw some ideas. I'll show you where some of our common spots are that a lot of you know of already, and some might not be as familiar. Step 3 is kind of like the meat and potatoes. Like on a lot of technical production, I just put these general estimates. That's kind of what I see, but they vary, But the majority of my time is in step 3. Step 4 varies quite a bit too. QC, reviews, revision, depending on your client, depending on who's reviewing, how many people are reviewing. Like I just did a MDT job with Rodell, and that hasn't been too bad, but whenever they get another reviewer on, it seems like that percentage ticks up a bit. So anyone who's done any amount of surveys for different clients knows that step 4 can be very different depending on your situation. And then step 5, just assembling your final technical deliverables, is usually a small piece. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, just saying it's part of the process, and that can vary a lot by client, from private to almost no time spent to Army Corps. I know some of you guys have made binders and binders of documents. So step 1 being the kickoff and discussion, I call it. It's a part I really like that maybe 5% of a project I spend on. And it's kind of like, in my mind, the first 10 plays of a football game that set you up for success for the rest of the game, or expectations are set to rapidly gain a quick project comprehension and understanding. And something in my career and even personally in relationships, I've realized this is pretty different depending on who you're working with, what team you're working with. Some people over communicate. Some people tell you way too much information. I have a tendency to do that. And then some people, it's like pulling teeth. That's just something I think you're always going to deal with. But it's a benefit of me to always be proactive, gathering information, no matter what. So I put a little comedy at the end. Some people give a lot of detail. Others, communicate about as good as my dad communicates his feelings, which is pretty much next to nothing. So that's kind of putting it on yourself to find information when it's not available. This is kind of my run through when I'm starting a project. I think about the main deliverables, the timeline, the scope, and the budget. And not always necessarily in that order, but I've found that at least having a little bit of a knowledge of those things has always helped me. The essential deliverables, high level, but you maybe don't have to know everything about them, but have a good idea. The clarity on scope, location, and client. Some of it's obvious, but some of it isn't always. And then the critical path deadline, I've always found really important to nail down quicker at the beginning with your team, or maybe it's one person. But if you can't get that, I find getting a best estimate helps me stay on track, because sometimes I get overwhelmed with prioritizing things, and at least having that in my mind as a best estimate has always helped me out. The earlier the better to voice deliverable constraints, budget constraints. You'll get better at assessing that as you get more experience. I know I have. Some of it's out of your control, like budget limitations. You can't always control that, but I've always it's always helped me to have some idea of what's going on. It helps me stay focused a little better. It helps me better manage my time. It just knows what I'm up against. You don't have to know everything there is to know about the budget or the deliverables, but it's helped me better produce products, and not just in the CAD aspect. Setting expectations, not assumptions. Learning from the past. File locations. So some of this is repeat. SharePoint, using it for project management docs, correspondence, emails, major contract stuff, not just the survey world. Sometimes deliverable packages that, like me and Mark on West Reserve MDT right now, we're having to use SharePoint a lot because there's some large deliverables that encompass all disciplines, not just survey specific. Project wise is replacing the F drive. That's where all of the survey specific research docs, scopes go. The local drives for LiDAR, PhotoGam, other stuff. And just the importance of sharing critical project information has always helped me, keeping things out of your inbox and desktop, which is kind of my two pro tips. I always, to the best of my ability, sometimes I fail at it too, move critical data to main project shared locations. And I try to think of the strategy, where should it go? And that's kind of tricky sometimes, I think, between the survey folder and SharePoint, but ask someone if you don't know, especially with project management docs. So the key takeaways I've found with any project, technical production, 1 or 2 hours of with a team or your colleague you're working with is, I would say, save 5 to 10 times the number of hours later, and just discussion helps prevent rework, out of scope work, lessens assumptions between everyone, builds your skills, and it usually you learn something, and you can be more independent and do things better in the future on your own. Now getting more into our specific stuff. I won't go through each of these links, but I'll add this maybe to this chat, this PowerPoint. I tried to use AI to make this PowerPoint, and it was like not as good as it usually does. So I had to do a lot of, because we have really specific stuff I wanted to put on here. But these are all links. I generally, if I don't know where to find stuff, I'll consult a PLS, PM, or someone more experienced than me, like where some of these agency requirements, standards, websites are. We have a lot of them we have already, and Bill, Hugh, Kurt, all of everyone who's kind of reorganized the survey documents has done a good job of consolidating these.
Hey, Aaron, real
Yeah.
quick. We are currently formulating a kind of a one-stop shop for client standards, and we're going to shortcut to a lot of the stuff you built in the CAD standards folder. So that is ongoing right now. But yeah, that's something we're actively trying to do is compile a lot of these standards and resources in one place so it's easier for everyone to find.
I guess related to that, I've struggled a bit knowing, hey, do I put this here? Do I put it on SharePoint? Do I make it a OneNote? I always save a lot of bookmarks. I'm kind of the king of saving bookmarks just in my personal, professional life. I mean, bookmarks to websites are always important, but is it going to be a combination of SharePoint stuff and the office? This is where most of the stuff I'm referencing on this slide is in these areas, finding client specific stuff for FEMAs or ULTAs, cadastral stuff like county checklists. This is where most of this was going. Even on our base camp, I know Tom's just kind of started something with the CAD standards. Are you guys going to lean more towards this, or a combination of this with SharePoint, or a OneNote, or a combination of all the above, Bill? What are you guys leaning towards?
Right now, we're thinking of a SharePoint folder with typical deliverable structure, reports, examples, stuff like that, and maybe a README file with some bullet points for each client. But yeah, it's more just a folder to kind of consolidate all this stuff in one easy to find place. But we're open to other ideas as well and how to get these standards all kind of accessible to everyone.
Tom just created one, for example, um, literally last month, like for IT stuff, and he's putting some of my CAD or our CAD stuff, my CAD stuff I've curated too on there. And I don't even know if it's live, but it's through Basecamp here, and I've been struggling with using and populating Basecamp, but I kind of think of it as more like important docs and URL links like that go to like a main resource doc or a YouTube video. That's a lot of stuff he's been putting in here. But another thing, and I'm kind of the king of bookmarks, and this is just a personal idea for you guys, or especially you younger guys building your skills. I bookmark a ton of stuff, and I have like piles of stuff, and this is just on my own internet browser, but it helps me go back and find stuff. You can also, put URL links on places where Bill's saying on shared SharePoint locations. I have one here of like a bunch of state-specific standards and agencies I've had to populate and all the states I've worked in over my career. That's just something I've done in my career that's helped me. These are way too full of stuff that I wouldn't want to put all of them on a shared spot. But I know the engineers too, this is something to look at. And I use OneNote in my personal life a lot, but engineers here have done it for like a kind of a centralized location for tips and tricks, Civil 3D. They have some MicroStation stuff, client-specific stuff. I like using Word and Excel as much as the next person, but I've used OneNote a lot for combining docs. It takes a bit to curate it, but this is just some ideas. I know like this is the engineering resource one, and this is like my personal one I've been using forever, like to put stuff on my hobbies and notes instead of them getting lost on my phone. But that's kind of a side thing. I've seen some of the power of OneNote for that, but it kind of takes an effort to say, hey, we're going to put things here, we're going to put them on Basecamp, or we're going to put them on SharePoint, or maybe a combination of all three. But anyway, a lot of that stuff lives here right now in SharePoint, DJNA, Survey Docs, Office Crew. They're pretty consolidated. A lot of the stuff for record sets is in here. If you don't see stuff here, get with your PM or someone more experienced and try to find some of this stuff populated for the next person. That's always benefited me, whether it's corner recs, process with a certain county in the US, checklists, things like that. And this one, I've used quite a bit with Altas with me and Hugh, just keeping these refreshed. And this is what I was saying. We have some hard documents in here. You can put web links in here to the current website, but I'm using these a lot as I'm kicking off a project, these areas. Some food for thought there, but yeah, the key takeaways: consult with someone first before diving into the abyss, someone that might know where something is. Chances are someone's either found it, downloaded it, has the checklist, knows the perfect website to go for that county. Share it in a central spot if you find it important enough. Hit up someone higher in the survey group that manages projects, or maybe not just higher up, but someone that might have an opinion of a good spot to put it, or take the initiative to try to do that yourself. Now getting into more of the meat and potatoes, survey drafting, records, and like I said, some of this stuff could apply to any type of drafting, but I'm going to try to get to some of the more specific record set stuff that's helped me in my career, starting now and a little bit later. But one of the questions I get a lot is when to use a new template, when not to. And this is just my general rule of thumb. I'd say the vast majority of the times, usually using a new one is the way to go, whether it's a blank DJNA one or a survey one or an MPS specific one. That being step one. Step two, deleting out unnecessary elements to a point. Don't delete out all your line types. Don't delete out all your blocks because you like that. You might need a few of them, so you got to do it a little strategically, but definitely deleting out excess layout tabs, redundant layout tabs. And then I usually find step three, bringing in relevant parts from old jobs, maybe Mons, maybe a signatory block, bring them in kind of a la carte is kind of my final step. And I've had the most success with that. But there are times, I'll go on the next slide, where sometimes saving as from an old drawing is the way to go. There's certain situations for sure. Future coming up here, me and Braden are experimenting with the attached template CAD function. I don't know of an equivalent in MicroStation, but we've been seeing it with MDT to build seed files. So you keep like a really built up seed file that has good stuff in the background, and I'll go to one right now. And you attach things you want later, like say a structural details drawing or a signage drawing or a survey mon drawing, or you could think of a lot of ways to go, like a bridge details drawing. It's basically in the Manage tab, and we haven't built this out yet. We're just starting to explore it based on what MDT's done. It's right here in the reference styles, and it opens up what's called an attached reference template. And we're trying to build this so you could possibly attach certain base templates, and some of this we would hope that would be loaded already. For example, I could go to our blank templates, which are really good for not having a bunch of layout tabs and excess stuff like that, or a full blank one that's literally nothing in it. Like I would use a template like that a lot of times to build an aerial that gets XREF'd into my final drawing, or a maybe a PDF of a record. But let's just take one of these, for example, the DJNA main one that is blank, but it has all the Civil 3D styles, AutoCAD styles in the background. So you can pick and choose different things to pull in. Some of it's a little dangerous, like maybe someone doesn't know what to do here, but things like layers would be a beneficial one for discipline specific, because civil drawings tend to have way too many layers. It's just kind of how Civil 3D is built. Like MDT is even worse than us. You think we have a lot of layers. They have like double, probably because they have more departments to try to appease. But you can take things in and out here to a certain point. The ones that are grayed out are automatically attached to a Civil 3D style here. So it does prevent you from damaging the drawing functionality a little bit. But there's other things we're still trying to learn if we can pull in blocks as needed. But this is something in the works to maybe, yep, okay, it does have blocks. I literally just started exploring it a couple weeks ago. So you can pull in a lot of the things like layers, blocks, AutoCAD styles, Civil 3D styles that can blow your drawing up if you start with some of our current templates, and you can get really specific to what you want. So this is kind of a maybe coming up this fall item. We'll probably have to do some videos on this. But we got to think of a strategy to create a really robust seed file, basically, for maybe, say, the survey department, or maybe everyone. We have the same seed file, and then you build on top of it, is what we're trying to do. But that's kind of in the works to maybe help with a little bit of like the base templates having too much in them, so to speak, for someone that doesn't need all that. This survey template, DJNA survey, STB, is still most of our projects. The MPS one, which is basically the same with various MPS stuff in the background for survey and design, is the next most used template. The blank template's still very helpful. I'll go to that right now. And this is just your first strategy of drafting. Like you're deciding, all right, am I going to start from new or do a save as? And you're kind of taking your time to think about this. So if I go here, I'll just stay in Windows Explorer so I don't have to go to internet browser with too many windows open. But these are the ones I'm talking about. These are the main ones with all the layout tabs, all the blocks, everything. These two are pretty much the same. One's just more for us doing survey record sets and very survey specific drawings, but they're very similar beyond that. The MPS one has survey and engineering in it. Those old MPS ones for Brendan and some people doing more MPS jobs, I haven't deleted them yet. They're still here. They're the legacy STBs. They're just kind of hanging out. As we do more jobs in the new style, they'll slowly get retired. The blank ones, though, I have one open, so those are there, but these are the main ones. These have all the good stuff in the background, but not the excessive amount of layout tabs. So these are really good candidates to start a new drawing, whether it's a record set or a survey map. But if I was doing a record set, I probably would start with the more full one because you have all your record set layouts. And then these are the full blank ones, literally with nothing in them, that I would use for things like making a drawing just for an aerial, or a drawing just with a title block in it that you XREF to all your sheets, or a drawing with a PDF layout that you're using in as XREF. So it has like 2 layers in it. It's tiny in file size. That's just kind of a reiteration of when I would use the full blank or the DJNA blank with our styles. That can get a little confusing. Anyone have any question on those? When to use them, when not? This one has all of our record set blank tabs on here, and there's one in the upcoming I've been working on with Hugh. It's a blank layout tab for Ultas. That one I might just get done this fall here, but that's going to be in here too, kind of like our other record set. I know Ulta's not necessarily a record set, but it's going to have a look and feel a lot like our other record sets, and it will be here. Next one. So when to use a save as from old jobs, there's times to do it. One time I can think of really specifically, I was talking to Kyle Todd a month ago, and some of his microstation drawings are so specific and kind of simplified down in SS4 microstation that he's had a lot of success just doing a lot of save ases and bringing things forward. And you might have more to add to that, Kyle. Maybe state specific has worked better for you. But if not much has changed in the standards for a while, and if you're savvy enough to know what you need and don't need, sometimes doing a save as of a really specific drawing is fine. It takes a little more maybe background knowledge of what's going on in the background of the CAD file. Him with BPA is a good example. If a lot of time has passed, and say like when me and Bob did the Stillwater subdivision between phases, there was several years, and we really redid our standards a ton in that time. The way to go with that one was to start new again, bring in stuff, clean it up. But if that subdivision all would have happened that year, those 2 phases, I would have probably done a save as from phase 5 to phase 6. That was a unique example of this whole template looks so much different than the one 3 or 4 years ago. So we started new, brought in what we needed, and it just was a lot cleaner product in the end. But subdivisions are a perfect example. If not enough time has passed and standards are about the same, doing a save as of an old subdivision phase and continuing on another one, or maybe a record set for the Forest Service. We've done that a few times with some Forest Service federal land. And if, let's say, it's adjacent to a couple sections and it's close enough to our standards, sometimes a save as and just repeating what we've done is okay. Just think about it, put a little critical thought into it, maybe get with a couple more experienced people if you're unsure, and you'll probably pick the right the right application for your scenario. But taking a few minutes to think about which way to go, brand new template, bring in what you need, or do a save as is definitely worth its weight in gold, and taking an hour there will save you a pile of time potentially later. So that's a big step to try to get right. Past project examples. So at this point in the game, I'm kind of like looking for direct examples. I was doing it yesterday with doing right-of-way plans for MDT, just remembering what I did. Sometimes their standards have changed, but it kind of keeps me focused, like a checklist in my mind visually. I can be a bit more of a visual learner, so it helps me not to forget things. And I'm not a huge fan always of going through a 2-page checklist. Those help too, but having a visual drawing has been huge for me to kind of take my game up to the next level when I do projects over and over, like an MPS or a COS for the city of Missoula. The more you have past examples, and you learn a lot too. Like, I didn't like the way I did that last time. Oh, I want to do annotative text in model space this time because I know how to do that. It helps you remember those things too. Here's our plans library. I've been populating it for a few years, and some of you guys helped me last month repopulate it when I was about to give this presentation last month, but it got postponed. And thanks for sending some up-to-date examples. It's here. And I got engineering plan sets in here too, and survey ones. And some of them are lacking, like they don't have a lot of good examples. Some could use some facelifts. Like we got some really good new Alta ones from ones I've done in the past, and especially ones Hugh did this year. Sometimes we could probably consider putting some of these in an old folder because it might give too much data for someone maybe, but a good example nonetheless. And the more current they are, the better usually. This one has quite a few in it for different clients. So some record sets we've done for different clients are in here. So any help you have I generally just put PDFs and DGNs and DWGs in here. I try to keep them down to those things. And yeah, some of the XREFs might not come along with them, but that's usually okay. Like when you open up a, like Mesdal in here, that's going to be one of my example ones from a few years ago. Me and Bob did this survey. Like if they come over to that plan set library area and they're missing a few XREFs, like this one doesn't have the vicinity map aerial, that's fine. The key I wanted with that area is to have a good PDF to see the final printed product and to have a CAD file to get into the nuts and bolts of whatever that person did, for an example. So if they don't have like the XREFs like this coming through, that's all right. And it also keeps that folder not being so bloated, especially with aerials. There's some links to that in that slide. So this is a bit too wordy because I was having a hard time consolidating my thoughts. So I'm doing my best not to read verbatim here, but now I got my template selected. I've talked with my PM or other people, or maybe use my past knowledge to figure out which direction to go there. I know the client, the scope. I have an idea of all the stuff I need to do. Now I'm ready to start bringing in data. You're getting into the nuts and bolts now. These don't have to go in order necessarily, but a little bit. For example, number one, the boundary resolution drawing. You don't have to do that right now, but maybe you did this. Depending on your experience level, you set up a boundary drawing, you're doing the resolution. I've had a lot of efficiency working with like Bob and Kurt and other surveyors in the past, kind of working with, they do most of the work, they dive into it, and maybe you'll get there someday doing that part. They got the records, they have a lot of things found in them. If I go to a couple of them, let's see, I have one from Hugh here and then one from I did with Kurt once. It's just a good time that this is kind of a standalone drawing. They're getting everything fit. They're checking records. They're finding gaps, scores, overlaps. They're really, you or whoever is getting this really dialed in, and it's meant to be kind of a clean drawing. Some people have XREF this in. I'm kind of a fan of keeping it in its own little world, and you work or solo in this drawing to kind of discover the property boundaries and easements and encumbrances and anything else. Like this one Kurt did, he had a lot of records. Me and him iterated on this a lot to say, hey, we're using this one. We use layer control, and he used layer control to like say the record name, so I wouldn't have to guess and dig in the documents he did. It helped speed us up, knowing which records I was going to annotate or which ones to focus on for what parts of the boundary, which ones like he didn't use. And Bob's done some of these too, where he started the annotations. Don't always have to go that far. We got mostly this one was pretty well resolved. We had a few things to fix, but it was like 95% there. And I brought it into the final record sets, and I started going to town with the annotations. So there's some difference in methodologies on this, and maybe if any of you guys have some really good advice on what you prefer here, totally speak up. This one's a little more annotated, but not really much more. Hugh put a few labels on, MTEX labels on the parcel names. He didn't label the bearings and distances. Like I said, I've seen Bob go that far, at least get the initial ones. He's checking the boundary gaps, overlaps, things like that. He even maybe will put a few records on there. That's kind of that step. There's a lot of little different ways to do it. I showed you a couple examples there that worked for me and others. That's in its own little world. And I try to keep it like that. So I bring it into my final drawing for annotation because I might change layers to their final form. I might shore them up to polylines so I can label them faster. I might, connect polylines, clean up redundant line types and stuff on top of each other. That's one reason I like to kind of keep them separate. And me or the other PM or surveyor can always go back to their boundary resolution drawing and check the initial work. Setting the coordinate system in my templates is the next one. I'm checking TBC, getting that all kosher. Then step 3 is kind of when the work begins in its next form, bringing in all your finalized line work, your COGO points. This is where communication's big with whoever's checked in the data, whoever's brought in the data. Maybe it's you, but sometimes it's not. Is I'm bringing in aerials, PDFs of as-builts, boundary line work we just talked about in the boundary resolution drawing. I'm bringing in a lot of that stuff. And as I'm doing it, kind of my pro tip, especially as surveyors, I'm doing like little QC spot checks in 1 or 2 spots of it, pretty much everything coming in, just seeing if I'm doing something wrong, maybe something got missed. I'm definitely doing it at this step as much as I can, and it's a lot easier than catching it later. Step 4, I'm doing my first kind of big dive into the final drafting. I'm cleaning up polylines. I'm checking the remaining like messy drafting. I'm putting things on the proper layers. I'm doing initial labeling of bearings and distances, curves, lines. I'm putting parcel labels, maybe some areas. I'm looking at my example drawings, doing this kind of at the same time. I'm not getting it to final. Call this maybe the 0 to maybe up to 60% phase-ish, depending on the complexity of the survey, or maybe it's an ULTA, and that would be even more work. But call it the 0 to 60 phase of that, maybe 0 to 30, depending on the complexity of the survey. In this last step, I'm kind of getting the final form of my COGO points in Civil 3D in the background. I'm putting all the raw data I brought in. I'm checking them. I'm getting them maybe, especially with sitemaps, I'm getting a couple final survey point groups that display all my final display COGO points. With a record set, not as much, but I've used point groups to display all those, and that kind of gets into my next advice with all the different MON types we have, especially with PLSS MONs. You can have 20 plus different appearing ones with found, set, and calced, for example. I won't go too overboard with COGO point groups, making them look a certain way, but I will use the power of the COGO point groups to have the data in the background always clickable and maybe in a non-plot layer. So when I bring in my blocks for, say, set quarter corners or set closed corners or whatever, calced, I have data I can click on and put the right block quickly in model space. That kind of comes in this step. I could almost skip to number 2 here, but from what I just said, but I'll go back to number 1 on the top. At this point, I'm kind of selecting my strategy. I'm storyboarding my layout sheets. I'm separating drawing files. I'll get to that in a second. I'm picking which paper space I want to use. Say it's like a ArcD for Montana COS. I'm making that decision. I'm trying to set a common scale. I'm moving things around to see if I can get it in one viewport. How does it fit? I might even kick a couple PDFs to the person I'm working on it with, like, how does this look? And then we both come to terms on it, and I'll start going to town with annotations more at that point. I'll start a sheet 1 signatory sheet at this point. I won't go too far with it. I might have to start from scratch. I might populate it from a previous job that I know was pretty close. That depends on your situation, and this is another one. If you don't know of a good example, someone could probably guide you to one. This one's a big one which drawing do I have what layout in? This can get kind of confusing, but there's some rule of thumbs. Like I'll show you a couple. Uh, Altas in particular with site maps, they can get really complex. I try to keep my record set drawings in one drawing as much as I can. I kind of went full bore with that with a one with Kurt a couple summers ago in Cody, Wyoming. I kept the site map, the ROS, and the Alta in one. It worked for me, but I had to do a ton of advanced layer control, annotative objects because we had different scale viewports. We had to turn a lot of things on and off, so it was doable. But if that would have been any more complex parcel, like a urban map of a hospital or something, I think splitting the drawings out would have been is definitely the way to go with like an Alta in that case. So, for example, so storyboarding the layouts kind of comes first. Getting the right scale, seeing how many sheets you can fit them on at a common scale, getting the general plan view sheets laid out, and maybe kicking a PDF out to who you're working with and just seeing if it looks all right. I'm doing that first. But in this case, I had a decision to make what to keep in this drawing, what to have in two separate drawings. I kept it all in one drawing, and it was definitely a little bit of a feat to have this drawing that was the ROS, this drawing a site map, and this drawing an Alta, which all show very different things. You can see they all look fairly different. They have a lot going on, a lot of different notes that would be on one or both, or maybe all three at times. So that was pretty difficult. If you feel confident in your CAD skills and you're really good at that, go for it. But I would say in general, this one, I would have made the site map separate, and I would have kept the ROS and the Alta in the same drawing file. Hugh did a good job of that on this Alta, which was in Denver. There's a few things he did differently that I wouldn't maybe have done, but in general, he kept this. He did a lot of annotating in model space. He did some in paper space. He had a few sheet layouts. He could have maybe done some more in model space, some more of the annotations. That's just kind of a skill in itself, and we'll get to it in a second. But he kept the Alta kind of in this separate file. He might have broke them out at a certain strategic point once he had the site map further in completion. Maybe Hugh can speak to what he did there when he split them out. Maybe he did at the beginning, but he did the site map separate. And I like the way he did that because this is a really complex site with, actually I clicked on something there. This was his boundary file for that. So I don't think I have his site map open. I just have the Alta open in CAD. I might have his site map open. Yeah, I have it open in PDF form. So you can see the site map here looks a lot different in Hugh's case than his Alta. His Alta, there's a lot of overlaps. I don't know if you can speak anything to that, Hugh. Like, did you get the annotations quite a ways before you split the drawings in two, or what do you think on that? Because I think that would be the way to go for those kind of situations.
If people haven't done Alta, there's a lot of dimensioning that is required per an Alta that isn't necessarily required for a site map. But I was going to mention is like all these decisions when you're breaking those out is something to be thought about. But a lot of this is also what you're delivering to the client. So if we're delivering a site map for design, that's great, but a lot of like the additional record for a COS or possibly a bunch of call outs for the dimensioning and stuff like that for an Alta may not be something that is necessary for the client to get, so like the deliverable of an Alta is the stamped certified PDF. There's nothing else, and if they want a site map, that's typically a drawing of a surface, and understanding the difference of what the deliverable and what the actual client is looking will sort of dictate the way you set this up and where you're going to put it all in one drawing or if you're going to split them up and stuff like that in particular. And especially when you get a drawing like this, because this site in particular was a quarter of a quarter section. It was massive. So much information we had to do that, and so much call outs and stuff is like, even to some extent, just trying to get everything squared away and consistent was part of breaking that down between the boundary, the sitemap, and the Alta. But ultimately, typically as surveyors, we're creating a product for a chain of going to design or after design or something like that. And you just need to know where your portion fits into that chain, and what product you're delivering will really direct how you put this together.
Yeah, it looks like this one, you did a lot of them in model and paper. You have a couple different scales, which makes annotating everything in model space more challenging. Um, and I'll show you my example with me and Bob's Stillwater subdivision. I thought that was one of the best ones I did, keeping everything in model as much as I could because it had different scales, like Hugh's Ulta here. It had two or three different scales in all the sheets. But he did his layout here, his storyboarding. At least if I could have, I would have done this as early as possible, like how I'm going to show this whole thing. But that might have been difficult because there's so many annotations on this one. There's other times where it's a little easier, like on this COS and the subdivision Missoula. I knew we had for sure a signatory sheet. I knew we had to do this sheet for the overall phasing showing because we did it in previous phases. I might not have known that if I wouldn't have seen that. This is at its own scale. Most of this stuff was in model space, but there's a few things. I'll go to the CAD drawing in a sec. And then I got these storyboarded out. I was like, okay, I got this scale. I tried a bigger scale at first. It wasn't working. It was just too much information. I knew annotating at this scale would have just been a disaster. Some of this takes experience. Some of it you'll just know when you work on it for an hour and you're like, this ain't working. That's the time to think about a different scale. Like I chose 1:40 scale here and I pieced it as best I could. It didn't get perfect. I sent a PDF to Bob and I said, what do you think about these four layouts? This one's a separate one. It's for like drain fields, but yet another one at a different scale. And we liked these three sheets. And then I kind of, at that point, I'm like, okay, I got my three main sheets. Now let me think of my annotation strategy. How am I going to annotate and where? So that kind of leads me into here. The next big one is select your overall annotation strategy. This is a really key step, almost as important, probably more important than picking the right template, but it takes more time. So if you select one method over another, you don't have to stick to it, but there's kind of a method to the madness. Generally, and there's not a one rule fits all for everything, but generally I put in red, I try to put labels and dimensions and all monument blocks in model space whenever possible, as much as I can. That's one I try to stick to as much as I can. Even with details, I try to use annotative whenever I can. You might not be as good with annotative objects as you know in AutoCAD. They're a little bit of a pain. You gotta Civil 3D objects are annotative inherently. They're smarter, but I'm talking M text, dimensions, M liters, and blocks. There's a little more caressing to get those to be annotative. And if you're not quite comfortable doing that yet, get with myself or Hugh or some of us others that have done those. They take a little more. There's a few more things to tweak with them. But the times to think about doing annotative objects in those things, the leaders, dims, and blocks, are when you have multiple layouts that are at different scales. That can be the handiest. Also, layouts that overlap each other. Those are just a pain either way. We have overlapping layouts. You'll have redundant things on one sheet that you don't want on another. That sometimes you just got to get really good with layers. Or once in a while, you got to put some things into paper space because you just can't make it work without reinventing the wheel. For example, in Mesdalin, this was a complex PLLS survey of a lot of area, many sections. And this one, I'll show it to you in CAD in a second, but I did a lot of stuff I like to do. I'll show you some things I didn't like that I fixed the next time I did a survey. This one had not a lot of overlap. Like these areas in gray were very segregated from each other. You can see a little overlap here. So I could have went to town doing annotations in model space if I was comfortable. I could have. There's some overlap. That's what I'm talking about with overlap. Sometimes you have different annotations in one spot that can get tricky, and sometimes you got to go to paper space. This survey had a lot more overlap spots. So I had to use annotative objects to, annotative objects are nice that they'll scale up depending on your scale of the viewport. And you can also move them to one location for 20 scale and a different location for 40 scale. So that's some of the power of them. Once you get good at using them, if let's say I had this annotation here that was in the right spot, but on another sheet, it was over here in the wrong spot at a different scale. Let's go back to a sheet at a different scale. Or somewhere right in here. That's literally the same annotation, but it scales up for this scale. I can put it completely spatially in a different spot than I did on the other sheet, and it's all in the same layer. So that's some of the power of using annotative. On Mesdalin, if I go into the CAD drawing, which gets interesting, one thing I did well, and a couple things I improved on in subsequent surveys, I didn't do a lot of the annotations in model space. I did quite a few in paper space. There was just a lot going on, and I kind of picked one and stuck to it. But I could have brought all these gray texts, these texts into model space, some others. But like these M leaders, these leaders here, they might have been a little difficult. These blocks for the mons, the unique mons, I wish I would have done those in model space. And I've did them in subsequent surveys, like for still waters that way. Some of them are just difficult. You have like these details, putting them in paper space with a new viewport layer was a good way to go. And then inside of these viewports, having unique layers that don't plot so you can do annotations was helpful. But once in a while, you can't get everything perfect and you just got to pick a method. And I did some of these annotations in paper space for these details. Instead of putting them in model space, having to have them on a unique layer because I want them to show here. But let's say I don't want them to show on the overall layout. So there's a little bit of method to the madness, and you're not going to get it perfect. I've touched the sun a little bit, and then I still find things that I would have done differently between jobs. So this one, I like detail views. These work best to have their own little world, their own little viewport. Annotate them in paper or model. You could go either way on that. But this one just had an excessive amount of leaders and callouts for all the mons, all the keynotes for all the mons. If I go to, let's see, PLS, let's go to still waters, and I'll show you the difference. This is one I kind of was like, all right, I'm going to start this one from the beginning. I'm going to try to do as much as I can in model space. And I got pretty close. Like this layout was a little harder. If I delete it, I had to put some wipeouts because I couldn't figure out a quick way to hide these in one view, but not another. There's a few things. This one has the most paper space stuff. But if I go to the storyboarded layouts here, the meat and potatoes of the subdivision, I think I got damn near everything in model space. And almost everything inside here is annotative, M-text, leaders, and DIMS. The AutoCAD stuff, like I said, the Civil 3D stuff, those are always annotative. Just they're separate worlds. They're always annotative, which is good. Leaders are the trickiest to do annotative. This one I think was not, but I did a few. They don't like to rotate well. So you have to give them, if you do make them annotative, you have to give them a manual rotation to the viewport, which I did here. I made them 30 degrees because when I made them, had them come in here, they were awkward like that when I brought them from paper space. That's the one thing you can do. M leaders are a pain in that way, being an annotative object, but M text and DIMS are a little easier. So you have to apply the different annotative scales to them. That's the biggest pain in the ass with them. You have to tell them if you don't have the type of scale. Civil 3D labels do this automatically. AutoCAD styles do not. I don't know why, but it's been kind of a detriment, I think, to them. I have all the scales in here. So, for example, on this one, I have it. They're all kind of concentric, and this is kind of an annoying thing with annotative objects. You got to see all the scales. But let's say I move it here. It's now broken away from what it would be in 80 scale. So printing at 40 scale, it's going to remain here. But when I go to my other drawing view, I'm trying to remember which one it was. Lot 35. It stayed here. See how it, in 40 scale, it's up here. In 80 scale, it remained where I wanted it. I just had to use some tricky wipeout here because me and Bob or the county or whatever wanted to see acres on one layout and not on the other. So that was a pain in the ass. But you encounter situations like that. Sometimes you got to get creative and use a wipeout, do a paper space annotation. But that's how those work. The blocks on this one, I was pretty happy to. We don't have annotative blocks. They're all static. And I was savvy enough to go in there and make them annotative. That's something that's upcoming too. These are annotative blocks. So instead of having Kogo point control, I made all these blocks annotative. You can make them static and do two different layers. Hugh does this a lot, one for whatever, 20 scale or 40 scale, and use two layers. That's another strategy. But I did all my mons in model space. So there's not a single mon in paper space. I didn't do that in Mesdalin. I wish I would have. That was a learning lesson that I applied to this drawing that I think I did a lot better. Another one I applied to this drawing, I repeated the legend in model space, and I put the viewport in multiple spots so I could edit it in one spot. Boom, done. Sometimes that can be difficult if a reviewer or agency wants a unique legend for each sheet. That can make it a little harder. But generally, most times, overall legend has worked in a lot of cases. I think you have your hand up, Kevin.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to ask about those wipeouts again. I didn't quite follow what you were saying there.
It was kind of a unique thing. I had a choice. I could have either had two different labels, one with just the lot and one with a lot in acres. I just chose the way and use like layer control. Instead of doing that, I just made a little wipeout and plopped it over all of them, all the acres. Because one view they wanted to see the acres on the lots, the other one they didn't. So
Okay. And how are you making those wipeouts?
they're on a layer that plots. Let me check, lay wipeout. I think that's in the standard template. Let me double check that one. It's on a plot layer, but I put, so it has to be on a plot layer, but it's a wipeout. So wipeouts don't inherently plot. So if I do a plot preview, you won't see that little box. You got to turn wipeout frames off. Otherwise you'll see it as a little box. So maybe a quick little thing on wipeouts. Let me turn that on right now and you'll see so wipeouts can be handy for that, especially with overlapping wipeout frame. With overlapping, I'm going to turn it back to off, I think. No, I guess that doesn't matter. See how that disappeared? So that didn't really matter. So I use wipeouts a lot when I have tough situations. You could use layer control, wipeouts with overlapping viewports. Sometimes I got to use some wipeout trickery. I had to use it a lot on these MDT right-of-way plans at match lines where there's some things I don't want to show from sheet to sheet. But anyway.
Okay, thanks. That's new to me.
That pretty much does it there. I try to keep as many things in model as I can. That's kind of my rule, not exception. And I make exceptions depending on the situation. I showed you a couple different ones there. Final phases, I'm doing the records review. I'm getting all my annotation records added to wherever possible. You know, I had my meeting with the PM or whoever did the records. Maybe it's myself, and that's when I'm going to town doing all the annotating of the records. This one probably doesn't have as many. Here's some. I'm adding all these annotations, these custom annotations to my bearing distances, my true ones. So I'm starting to do more of that final annotating. Number two, I'm staying consistent with the annotation strategy. You pick one, try to go with it, whether you use annotative or static, model space or paper space, preferably more model space. Try to be consistent. I showed you some of the details. I'm always doing those in their own viewports, and they're in their own viewport in paper space. Monuments drafting, me and Kyle were talking about this the other day. Do not draft those in model space. They're a pain in the ass. The architects freaks out. A lot of our old drawings have them in model space. They work way better in paper space. If you have them in paper space and you move them to model space, you can bounce between the two, but it doesn't work the other way. They like to blow up. So like on Mesdalin, there was times, let me just double check my work on this. So like I had them all in paper space. This one's grouped because it's all in one piece. It's not a block, but I could have put it in model space. I chose paper space here, but they just worked a lot better drafted in paper space. So this would be a good example to pluck from. And we had to draft a whole pile of them in model space, or excuse me, paper space. Those just works. The architects likes to blow up if you go from model to paper, but it doesn't. If you go the other way, it works fine. So that's some tips on those. I try to do those in paper space whenever possible, and then I can move them to model space as needed from that point. But these are another little topic in themselves. They like to have these arcs to keep the text. It's still kind of an old school tool in AutoCAD that doesn't work that well. What else? Final title block and legend. I mentioned that. I try to keep the legend its own viewport whenever possible. That's worked pretty well for me. So I try to keep it in model space. Give me a second. And I just put the same viewport in all the sheets. So I only have to edit it in one spot. The key is to not have to edit it in 5 sheets. So that's worked well for me. There's been times I've failed to do that I have to remind myself. I see on like these Ultas, I think I did it on mine, but Hugh didn't on his. It's all right if you put it in paper space, but especially if you have one sheet layout, it probably doesn't really matter. But the more layouts you get, the more you want to maybe think about doing this in model space, the legend, or any repeat things like this, so you only have to edit in one spot. The title block.
Just to a moment, just to reiterate what you're saying on that whole model and paper space. A lot of that paper space they're talking about is because our final deliverable is a recorded document. So we're a PDF version essentially. And that's, again, thinking about deliverable and what you're providing to the client. If it is a recorded document, it's going to be only the PDF that's going to be recorded. That makes much more sense to be able to have a leniency to do a few more things in paper space. While if your deliverable is only the actual CAD, then you have to think about a little bit smarter if labeling has to be in model space for XREF into a design drawing. I just wanted to reiterate that while Aaron keeps bringing up these different options.
That's a good point. You could choose either one for record sets usually. Generally, the more sheets I have, the more I want it in model space to keep edits in one spot. If you have a survey map, it might be different. Maybe you want to have you might want to have it in model space because the engineer is bringing it in. But yeah, for record set, think about the end audience. With title blocks, I generally will keep them in the drawing, but you don't have to. I've done some advanced things like when I have a lot of repeat sheets, I'll make it an XREF. That's kind of a pro tip, especially with long corridors. And I'll put this in its own drawing. So say it has 50 sheets, and I will edit this in one spot in that XREF, and it updates in all my sheets. That's just a pro tip. You don't always need to do it. A lot of our survey drawings don't have enough sheets. It's one of those catch-22s, like if you have over 10 sheets, it really starts to be an efficiency increase. If you have 3, 4, 5 sheets, it's kind of a toss-up. Signatory sheet, I get that kind of 90% complete at this point. I hold off on the legal description until the first QC. So main takeaways for drafting survey records, just focus on the standards rather than the exceptions. Pick strategically, spend some time. Do you start with a new template, bring in old things, or do you save as? Consider that pretty early on and take some time there. Take some time to carefully spend storyboarding the layouts and the scales. Think about your annotation strategy. Spend more time on that than less. Those two things will help you out if you spend a little time on that. And then if you're stuck on anything, hit up some more experienced colleagues or some of our resources. I think we're about out of time. I had some things with QC. This wasn't really about that as much, but the one or two things to add to QC with record sets. I like to do a lot of plot previews when I'm getting to that 90% phase after a lot of my in-depth annotations are close. I've storyboarded my layouts. I've agreed with someone that they look good. I got my signatory sheet 1 or 2, pretty close. I start doing a lot of plot previews at that point. And that helps me a lot to get my mind looking what it will look like in PDF form. Back in the day, we always used to plot these to paper. You don't really need to do that. I just generally do a plot preview. And I'm doing this a little more thoroughly after I got as much as I think done on this before the first QC at 90%. I always find one thing to a dozen things. I check them and I'll go through one sheet at a time, and then it's kind of off to plotting for QC. And we got our own survey folder for that, survey number 11. And a couple tips I have for QC reviews is I wait till after the first major, call it 90% red line review, to do my legal descriptions. Has been kind of helpful for me. It kind of helps me from doubling my work because there's always some mistakes. And I've been finding Bluebeam studio sessions, I've kind of switched over from Adobe the last year and a half, and they've been it's been a super huge efficiency gain for me on Teams to do red lines in live time. And I've also been really liking a lot of the tools they have to do more industry things like set the scale of the drawings and make measurements and add things to toolboxes to repeat use. But just a couple tips there. That's all I have. Anyone else have anything? I can go into some of these examples, or I try to keep to two clashing drawings that I've done that I like. Some things I did in one and not the other, between the Stillwaters and Mezzalin, because they both had a lot going on. But just to show you the complexities or the things you just situationally come up that you just got to make a choice where to put things. And like Hugh said, think about your final audience, and if maybe it's just a PDF, or if someone needs it in model space to be XREF'd in somewhere.
Can you just define what you mean more when you use the term storyboarding?
So think of like a movie, when they do little sketches before, like they do a Matrix action scene or something. Setting your layouts, your signatory sheet, these ones are in final form, so it's not really true, but I probably got them to like 75% close on that storyboard phase. So basically setting up your sheets close to their final form as much as you can before you go fully to town annotating. You're going to spend more
Choosing
time
what?
choosing the scale, choosing the type of title block for the correct agency, for the correct client, getting the scales, see how much you can fit in one, making a decision like, will this be too busy? And then at that point, you might split it to 2 or 3 in your storyboard. you could kind of apply it to doing any type of drawings, Clay. It's it's kind of a thing I do before I go to town doing the nitty gritty details and the annotating. I'll spend, call it getting up to the 30% in the storyboard. And if I'm liking it, I'll send it off to someone to say, hey, what do you think about this? And some people could care less, but they might see something you're missing, like, hey, you missed that corner there, or what about that? I don't know if that answers your question, but
That
that's
that very much answers my question. Thanks. And I imagine that also aids you when it comes time to choosing your annotation strategies. So yeah, I'm up to speed. Thank you.
yeah. You're
Uh,
as you're doing that,
uh,
it helps kind of guide you, like how I'm going to annotate this efficiently, for sure, Clay, too. So
I was going to say prior to annotative scale, we could change our text very quickly depending upon that. You'd have to do this to make sure your scale was set. So when you set all your M text and all your dimension, because if you changed it after the fact, then you're redoing a bunch of work. That's where it was really critical before we had annotative text. But again, visualizing and seeing where they're so you know what text or a scale style is the critical thing on this.
Thanks. Yeah, that's awesome.
but in general, this drawing, I did way more stuff in paper space than I needed to. It looks fine in the end. I would have done a few more things in model space. And then in this drawing, I felt like I did almost as much as I could in model space, and it turned out pretty good. But different strategies that I kind of picked early on in the storyboarding phase. If any of you guys related to that, Clay hit me up with this the other week to end on this. Want to learn how to do view frame groups to make sheets really quickly from alignments, especially for like corridors, like you do a pipeline. That's another topic. I think I sent you those YouTube videos, Clay, to quickly make plan and profile sheets or plan and plan sheets. That's something maybe if you guys ever do like a long linear survey, let me know about that. It can really speed you up, especially if it's a long one with a ton of sheets. But you won't deal with that on record sets as much. They're more overlays and plan views of different square rectangular type shapes. So who's up next month then?
Next month is going to be John